The alarm cut through the silence before I even understood what it meant. Red light. No sound from the speakers. Just a pulsing red light above the door of Conference Hall 7. And 40 alien nobles behind me who had laughed at me only 3 hours earlier. My name is Ethan Voss. I was a guard. Not a soldier anymore, not officially. Just a guard standing outside a door on a space station that did not belong to my people, protecting men and women who thought I was barely worth their attention. The station was called Threnna. It belonged to the Calith Dominion, a species that had welcomed humanity into their circle of allied worlds only because the rules of their council forced them to. They never let us forget that we were the newest, the smallest, and in their eyes, the least important voice at the table. That morning, before the alarm, before everything changed, Lord Threxus Vale had walked past me with his usual smile. He was tall, with skin the color of polished silver, and eyes that never seemed to blink. He stopped in front of me the way he always did, just to remind me where I stood in his world. He looked at the small metal medal pinned above my chest. It was old, dull, nothing like the glowing jeweled chains the Calith nobles wore. "Tell me, guard," he said, his voice smooth and amused. "Do they give a medal to every human who learns to stand still for so long?" The nobles around him laughed. I did not answer. I was trained not to answer. He reached out and tapped the medal lightly, like it was a toy. "What is this for? Attendance? Good behavior?" "It is a service medal, my lord," I said. "From my old unit." "And which glorious victory earned you this shining reward?" "None, my lord. I earned it for a battle we lost." The laughter grew louder. Even Threxus smiled wide, delighted that I had made a joke against myself. He turned and walked into the hall without another word, and the door closed behind him and the other nobles who had gathered for their meeting. I stood outside, as I always did, holding a weapon that was not even allowed to carry real ammunition. The Calith Council had decided long ago that human guards were only there for show. Our rifles were loaded with nothing but stun charges, weak enough to knock down a small child and do little else. It did not matter to them that I had once served on the front lines of the worst siege humanity had faced in decades. To them, I was just a decoration standing by a door. That was the world I lived in until the alarm went off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Threnna Station was never silent. There was always a low hum of machines, distant voices, the soft chime of doors opening and closing along the corridor. But in the space of a few seconds, all of it stopped. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied into a dim red glow. I touched the small communicator on my wrist. Nothing. No signal, no static, no response. My hand went instinctively to my rifle, even though I knew what was loaded inside it would barely slow down anything serious. Down the corridor I heard it, a grinding sound, metal against metal, coming from the maintenance shaft that ran behind the conference hall. That shaft was supposed to be sealed at all times. Nobody was supposed to have access to it except station engineers, and even they needed 3 different approvals to open it. The grinding stopped. Then came a hiss, like pressurized air escaping, and the sound of something heavy dropping onto the floor on the other side of the wall. My mind moved fast, faster than it had in years. Whatever was coming through that shaft was not station maintenance. Nobody used that entrance during a normal day, and certainly not during a full communication blackout. I thought about the door behind me. 40 Calith nobles were inside that room, including Lord Threxus Vale, and not one of them carried a weapon. Their culture did not train them for danger. They had never needed to. For centuries, other species had done their fighting for them, had guarded their borders and stood outside their doors, while the nobles debated policy and comfort. I stepped forward and pressed my back against the wall beside the maintenance shaft entrance. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. Years of training did not disappear just because nobody believed in me anymore. The panel covering the shaft entrance groaned, then buckled outward. A shape pushed through, low and quick, moving with the kind of speed that told me this was not an accident and not a rescue. It was an intrusion. I recognized the shape almost immediately from old briefing images. Vren Raiders, a species known across this part of space for striking outposts and stations that looked weak or unprotected, taking whatever resources they could carry, and vanishing before any real defense could organize. They usually avoided Calith territory because the Dominion kept powerful fleets nearby. But Threnna Station, for all its political importance, was lightly guarded on the inside. The Council had always assumed that no one would dare attack a diplomatic station. They were wrong, and I was the only thing standing between 6 raiders and 40 unarmed nobles trapped in a room with a single door. I did not shout. I did not hesitate. I raised my rifle and aimed for the first shape moving through the gap in the wall. The moment it took a full step into the corridor, I fired. Even with the weak charge in my weapon, A direct hit was enough to knock the first raider back through the opening it had just come from. It collapsed against the shaft wall, stunned. But that only bought me a few seconds. 5 more were still coming. I moved to the side of the corridor where a support column gave me cover. My mind ran through everything I remembered from training. Do not stand in open space. Use the environment. Make every shot count, because you may not get a second chance at close range. The second raider came through low, trying to avoid a direct line of fire. I adjusted and caught it across the shoulder as it turned toward me. It staggered but kept moving forward. These were not creatures that gave up easily. Behind me, I heard the door of the conference hall shake as something inside pressed against it, trying to understand what was happening. I did not dare look back. If that door opened even a crack, the nobles inside would be exposed. I called out without turning my head. Stay inside. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. I do not know if they understood human speech well enough to follow those exact words, but I heard the sound of a heavy latch sliding into place a moment later. At least that was something. The corridor was narrow, which worked in my favor. The raiders could not surround me easily. They had to come at me 1 or 2 at a time through the gap they had created, and that gave me just enough space to hold my position. A third one came through fast, faster than the others, clearly trying to catch me off guard, while I was still recovering from the second exchange. I dropped low, letting the shot meant for me pass over my shoulder, and fired upward as it closed the distance. The stun charge caught it directly in the chest, and it dropped hard onto the floor, sliding a short distance before stopping completely. 3 down. 3 still active, either stunned on the ground or retreating back into the shaft to regroup. My rifle's charge indicator blinked a warning. I was running low on power, and there was no way to reload quickly in the middle of an active threat. I pressed myself further into the cover of the column and tried to steady my breathing. This was the moment every soldier trains for and hopes never to face. The moment when the numbers are against you, when the equipment is not enough, and the only thing left to rely on is willpower and whatever skill you managed to build over years of preparation. I thought of Quran Ridge. I thought of the 11 days my unit had spent holding a supply corridor against odds far worse than this, buying time for 100,000 people to escape a dying colony. We had lost that fight in the end. The line broke on the 12th day, but those 11 days had given enough time for almost everyone behind us to reach safety. That memory did not scare me. It steadied me. I heard movement again from the shaft, 2 shapes this time, moving together, clearly trying a different approach after losing 3 of their group to my defense. I shifted my position slightly, keeping the column between myself and their most direct line of attack. The first of the 2 moved fast along the left side of the corridor, trying to flank me, while the second pushed straight down the middle as a distraction. I recognized the tactic immediately. It was a simple pincer move, something raiders without much discipline still managed to execute when desperate. I chose to deal with the direct threat first. As the second raider came into range, I fired, catching it mid-stride. It dropped just a few steps away from the column I was using as cover. That left the one trying to flank me. I turned just as it came around the edge of the column, close enough that I could see the strange reflective plating along its arms, glinting in the red emergency light. My rifle's charge indicator blinked one final warning. I had 1 shot left before it would need a full recharge cycle that I did not have time for. I aimed and fired at the closest possible range, catching it just as it raised its own weapon toward me. The charge was enough to stop it, but only barely. It collapsed forward, and I stepped back quickly to avoid being caught underneath it as it fell. 5 down, 1 left, somewhere behind me in the shaft, likely deciding whether to continue the attack or retreat now that its group had been reduced so quickly. My rifle was empty. I set it down carefully and reached for the small backup blade every guard carried, more of a tool than a proper weapon, used mostly for cutting through emergency panels or trapped wiring. It was not built for confrontation, but it was all I had left. I waited, my back against the wall beside the shaft opening, listening for any sign of movement. Seconds passed, then a full minute. The silence stretched on, broken only by the low hum of the emergency lighting system. Finally, I heard the sound of the shaft sealing itself from the other side. A heavy mechanical click, followed by silence. The last raider had chosen to retreat rather than face what was left of its group. Whatever this attack had been meant to accomplish, it had failed. I allowed myself to breathe for the first time in what felt like several minutes. My legs were shaking slightly from the tension, but I forced myself to stay upright and alert until I was certain the threat had truly passed. The station's main power flickered back to life a short while later. Lights returned to their normal brightness. The low hum of machinery filled the corridor once again, as if the world was slowly remembering how to function. My communicator buzzed with a flood of delayed messages, all coming through at once now that the signal had been restored. I checked the corridor one final time before turning toward the conference hall door. I knocked twice, then spoke clearly. "It is safe now. You can open the door." There was a pause, then the sound of the heavy latch sliding back. The door opened slowly, and Lord Threxus Vale stepped out first, his usual composed expression, replaced by something I had never seen on his face before: genuine shock. He looked past me at the corridor, at the 3 stunned raiders still lying on the floor, at the scorch marks along the walls where my shots had missed their targets, at the sealed shaft where the 6th attacker had retreated. Then his eyes came back to me. "You held this corridor," he said slowly, as if trying to convince himself the words were true. "Alone." "Yes, my lord." He looked at the medal still pinned to my chest, the same one he had mocked only hours earlier. This time, he studied it differently, like he was seeing it for the first time. "You told me this was for a battle you lost," he said. "I did, my lord. My unit held a corridor for 11 days so that 100,000 people could escape a dying colony. We lost the position in the end, but we gave those people the time they needed. Command still felt it deserved recognition, even though we did not win." He was quiet for a long moment. Around him, the other nobles slowly stepped out of the conference hall, their eyes wide as they took in the scene in the corridor. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. The evidence of what had happened was clear enough without words. "There were 40 of us in that room," Threxus said finally. "You are 1 guard." 40 to 1, I said, allowing myself the smallest hint of a smile. "Better odds than I am used to, my lord." He did not laugh this time. He simply nodded, a small gesture, but one that carried more weight than any of his earlier words. In the days that followed, the investigation into the attack revealed that a small group of Vren raiders had somehow bypassed the outer sensors of Threnna Station, taking advantage of a routine maintenance window to slip through an old service shaft that had not been properly sealed in years. It was a security failure that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with the council that had spent so much time assuming their station was untouchable that they had neglected the basic upkeep required to keep it safe. The council convened an emergency session 2 days later. I was not expected to attend, since guards were rarely invited into any formal discussion, but Lord Threxus Vale requested my presence personally. It was the first time in 6 months that anyone had asked for my opinion on anything. Inside the chamber, surrounded by nobles from a dozen different worlds, Threxus stood and spoke about what had happened in that corridor. He described, in detail, how a single human guard, armed with a weapon barely stronger than a training device, had held off 6 trained raiders long enough to protect an entire room of unarmed council members. He spoke about the rule that had stripped human guards of any real means of defense, a rule passed years earlier under the assumption that human soldiers were too unpredictable to be trusted with proper weapons. He argued, calmly but firmly, that the events of that day proved exactly the opposite. It was not unpredictability that had saved that room. It was discipline, training, and a willingness to stand firm even when the odds were impossible. The council debated for hours. Some nobles resisted the idea of giving humans anything beyond symbolic authority. Others pointed out that if the attack had succeeded, the loss would have reached far beyond a single corridor. It could have crippled leadership across a dozen allied worlds in a single afternoon. By the end of the session, the council voted to change the rule. Human guards stationed throughout conquered facilities would now be equipped with weapons suited for genuine defense, the same standard given to guards of every other species serving in similar roles. It was a small change in the larger structure of interstellar politics, but for those of us who had spent months being treated as decoration rather than protection, it meant everything. After the session ended, Threxus approached me in the hallway outside the chamber. He was quieter now, without the crowd of nobles around him, without the audience he usually performed for. "I misjudged you," he said. "I misjudged all of your people, I think." "You would not be the first," I answered. "We are used to being underestimated. It has happened before, on our own world, long before we ever reached the stars. And yet you still choose to stand guard for those who mock you." I thought about that question for a moment before answering. Someone has to hold the line, my lord, whether anyone respects the person holding it or not. That was true on my world, and it seems it is true out here as well. He looked at the medal on my chest one final time, then extended his hand in the human gesture he had clearly learned just for this moment. I shook it, and for the first time since arriving on Threnna Station, I felt like I was standing there as an equal, rather than as a piece of furniture assigned to guard a door. Word of what happened spread quickly through the station and beyond, carried by nobles returning to their homeworlds with stories about the human guard who had held a corridor alone against impossible odds. Some of the details grew larger with each retelling, the way stories always do. But the core of it remained true. One guard, 6 attackers, a locked door that never opened. I stayed on Threna Station for another year after that day, still standing outside doors, still watching over rooms filled with people who once thought little of me. But something had shifted in the way they looked at me now. The laughter was gone. In its place was something closer to respect, quiet and unspoken, but real. The metal on my chest never changed. It remained the same dull piece of old metal it had always been, a reminder of a battle we lost long ago on a world far from Threna Station. But its meaning had changed for everyone who saw it now. It was no longer something to laugh at. It was a reminder that the ones who hold the line, even in defeat, often become the ones who matter most when everything else falls apart. And on a station built by people who once believed strength only came from wealth, status, and old bloodlines, that was a lesson none of them ever expected to learn from a single, quiet, unarmed guard standing outside a door.